My name is Miller Files. I work cases that do not let go, not because they are famous, not because they are cinematic, but because they break a rule the human mind depends on. The rule is simple. You drop a child off at school in the morning. You pick that child up in the afternoon. On June 4, 2010, at Skyline Elementary School in Portland, Oregon, that rule collapsed. A 7-year-old boy named Kyron Horman walked into a building filled with teachers, parents, and children. There was a science fair that morning, the kind that turns a school hallway into a small festival. Bright poster boards, tables packed tight, parents moving in clusters, polite and distracted, holding cups of coffee and cameras. Kids darting around like pinballs, excited and overstimulated, wearing their pride on their sleeves. That morning, someone took a picture of Kyron standing beside his display. He looks like any other kid who wants to be seen, who wants the world to confirm that his small project matters. In the photo, his eyes are calm behind his glasses, his posture relaxed, his shirt dark with bright lettering that reads like a joke grown-ups would notice. The details of what he wore that day were later recorded carefully, because when a child vanishes, clothing becomes a kind of last-known coordinate. A black shirt with CSI lettering, dark pants, sneakers, a metal-framed pair of glasses, ordinary items that turned into the language of flyers and billboards. The last reported time Kyron was seen that morning is around 8:45 a.m. The words sound precise, like a nail driven into wood. But when you work missing child cases, you learn to treat time like fog. People remember what feels true. They remember what fits the story their mind is trying to build. They remember a moment and later attach a clock to it because it helps the memory stand upright. Still, 8:45 a.m. becomes the hinge of this case. That is the moment the world believes Kyron is still inside the building, still moving toward a classroom, still safe inside a system designed to keep children contained. Then the day keeps moving. Lessons, lunch schedules, bells, paperwork, the 1,000 routine actions that make a school function. And somewhere in that routine, Kyron never arrives where he is supposed to be. The absence is not noticed instantly because school is a machine built to manage crowds, and machines sometimes lose a single part without sounding an alarm. In the afternoon, Kyron does not get on the bus home. By 3:56 p.m., a 911 call is placed. By 3:59 a.m., law enforcement is dispatched. By the early evening, search and rescue is activated. The response, at least on paper, comes fast once the disappearance is recognized. But that is the cruel trick. The critical window is not the afternoon. The critical window is the morning, the slice of time when the school was open, busy, and porous. Porous is the word I keep coming back to. People think a school is sealed. It is not. It has doors. It has parking lots. It has hallways that branch like river channels. On a normal day, the school is controlled by routine. On a science fair morning, routine bends. Parents come in and out. Visitors blend with familiar faces. Teachers are pulled in multiple directions. The building becomes a place where a stranger can look like they belong if they act like they belong. A child does not need to be grabbed to be taken. A child can be guided. A gentle hand on a shoulder, a quiet sentence delivered with confidence. Come with me. Your teacher needs you. Your mom is waiting. The difference between safety and danger can be nothing more than whether the adult voice is trusted. When I read the publicly available facts, I see two possibilities fighting each other in the shadows. The first is that Kyron left the building with someone, deliberately during a moment of confusion. The second is that he left the building alone, drifting into the edges of the campus and beyond, and something irreversible happened before anyone realized he was missing. Both possibilities depend on the same ingredient: a gap, a blind spot, a handful of minutes that were not recorded, not witnessed cleanly, not captured in a way that could survive years of argument. That is why this case is so difficult. Not because people did not care. The response was massive. Not because the family did not push. They did. Not because the community forgot. They did not. The case is difficult because the disappearance happened in a place that should have been the safest, and it happened at a time when the environment created the perfect camouflage. As a detective, I do not start with suspicion. I start with geometry. I draw the building in my mind. I imagine the flow of bodies. I think about the doors that lead to the outside, the corners where no one stands, the moments when a child could pivot out of sight and never return. I ask which movements would look normal to a passing adult and which movements would look wrong. I ask how a person could remove a child from a crowded environment without causing a scene. And I ask the question that follows every vanished child into the dark. Who noticed what? And when did they notice it? Because the first notice is often the most important clue. And in this case, the first notice came too late to preserve the clean edges of the morning. This is episode 1, and all we have done is enter the building. We have walked into the science fair. We have watched the hallway fill and blur. We have listened to a timestamp that may or may not be solid. We have felt the moment when routine swallowed a child. In the next episode, I will take you deeper into the timeline and the mechanics of a school morning. I will show you how a disappearance can happen in plain sight without anyone understanding that they witnessed it, because that is the most terrifying possibility. Not that nobody saw, but that somebody did, and they did not know what they were looking at. I am Miller Files, and in episode 1, we walked into Skyline Elementary on a morning that felt harmless, a science fair. A hallway full of parent voices and classroom smells. A child in a dark shirt standing beside a project that mattered to him. A single photograph that later became a kind of last proof. Now we do what investigators always do after the first wave of shock passes. We stop staring at the headline and we start studying the machinery. Not the rumors, not the arguments. The machinery, because a school is not just a building. It is a system. It runs on routines, so ordinary that adults stop seeing them. The bell schedule, the attendance sheet, the flow of bodies from one room to another. And when a child disappears inside that system, the answer is usually hiding in the moment when the system quietly failed to notice a missing part. On a normal day, the school morning has a rhythm you can almost hear with your eyes closed. Doors open, children arrive in bursts. Parents peel away at the entrance like leaves in a current. Teachers stand at thresholds, scanning faces, adjusting backpacks, answering questions, doing the gentle work of turning chaos into order. Then the bell. Then the classrooms become containers, each one holding its small universe of desks and pencils and rules. But this was not a normal morning. A science fair changes everything in subtle ways. It adds adults to the hallways. It adds movement across places that are usually controlled. It shifts attention away from the strict business of counting children and toward the softer business of hosting a community. Everyone is still trying to do their job, but their job now includes greeting, smiling, watching for spills, guiding visitors, and making sure the displays survive the stampede of curiosity. In investigations, we call this kind of environment permissive. Not because anyone is careless, because the event itself demands loosened control. A school becomes slightly porous, and porosity is where disappearances breathe. I want you to picture the exact kind of moment that makes a case like this possible. It is not dramatic, it is not loud, it is quiet in the worst way because it looks normal. A parent steps aside to take a picture. A teacher leans down to tie a shoelace. A child darts behind a cluster of adults. A door opens and closes. Someone says, "Excuse me." Someone laughs. Someone checks their phone. This is the soft blind spot, the small pocket of time where no single person is responsible for watching one particular child, because everyone assumes someone else is watching. And in that pocket, a child can be guided away without force. That sentence is hard for people to accept. They want a struggle because a struggle leaves evidence. They want shouting because shouting creates witnesses. They want a villain who acts like villains do on television. Real predators do not need to act like villains. They need to act like they belong. When I reconstruct a school disappearance, I start with two maps. The first is the physical map. The doors, the hallways, the stairwells, the bathrooms, the corners where sound dies. The second is the human map. Where did adults naturally stand? Where did they naturally look? Where did children naturally flow? Which spaces were crowded and which were empty? In Kyron Horman's case, public information tells us that the last reported sighting is around 8:45 a.m. in the morning, with a child moving toward his classroom. That is the hinge. But, as I told you, time in witness accounts can be fog, so I do not treat 8:45 a.m. as a conclusion. I treat it as a question shaped like a number. If Kyron was truly seen walking toward class at 8:45 a.m., then the science fair crowd might already be thinning. That matters because it changes the list of plausible scenarios. A crowded hallway gives cover to an outsider. A quiet corridor narrows the field toward people with access and familiarity. But if 8:45 a.m. is an estimate, then the disappearance could have happened while the hallway was still full of visitors. In that case, an outsider becomes more plausible, not because outsiders are common, but because the environment would allow one to hide in plain sight. So the work begins with precision, not the kind of precision you get from a stopwatch, the kind you build from layered truth. You interview people, and you do not ask them what time it was. You ask them what they remembered doing before they saw the child. You ask them what they did right after. You ask them where they were standing, what they were holding, what the light looked like in the hallway. You rebuild time from sensory anchors because human memory is better at scenes than it is at clocks. Then you take those scenes and you line them up. You look for overlaps. You look for contradictions. You look for the places where two people swear they were in the same spot at the same moment, but their stories do not match. Those mismatches are not always lies. Sometimes they are the sound of stress-bending memory, but sometimes they are the sound of a door you did not know existed. In a case like this, attendance becomes the cold heart of the story. People hate that. They want emotion. Attendance is paperwork. Attendance is boring. Attendance is where the truth often hides. Here is why. Attendance in elementary school is a ritual built on assumptions. A teacher calls names. A child answers. Or the teacher counts heads. Or the teacher checks a roster after the morning settles. Those methods are fine on a normal day. On an event day, the method can blur. A class might start late. A child might be in the hallway finishing a look at the displays. A child might be sent to the office. A child might be in a different room for a few minutes. If Kyron never made it into the classroom, then the system might not have noticed immediately because the morning was already out of its usual shape. And if the system did not notice immediately, then the first true alarm was delayed until the end of the day when the bus routine exposed the absence. That is a cruel design flaw in many missing child cases. The absence is discovered not when the child vanishes, but when the child fails to complete a later step, the bus, the pickup line, the after-school program. The absence becomes visible only when the child does not appear where they must be. Now I want to slow down and let you feel how that delay changes everything. In the morning, a few minutes matter. In the afternoon, hours have already passed. Search teams can mobilize quickly, but no one can reverse time. The first hours are the cleanest hours. The evidence is freshest. The witnesses are closest to the moment. The environment has not yet been trampled by concern and confusion. In Kyron's case, public timelines show law enforcement response within minutes of the 911 call in the afternoon. That is not nothing. That is a real response. But the disappearance did not start in the afternoon. It started in the morning, and the difference between those two clocks is the space where a person with intent can win. So how does a person win inside a school? They win by using the rules of human perception. Most adults do not question a child walking with an adult. They question a child crying. They question a child struggling. They question noise. A predator who plans to remove a child from a busy environment does not want noise. They want compliance. They want the child to believe the adult is safe, or at least to hesitate long enough for the adult to get to a threshold. The threshold is everything. The threshold is the moment between inside and outside. Inside is controlled by social norms. Outside is controlled by distance. If you can get a child to the threshold without a scene, you have changed the entire case. This is why I obsess over doors. Doors are not just exits. They are opportunities. On a school campus, there are doors everyone uses, and doors that exist for staff, for deliveries, for maintenance, for convenience. During a special event, the main entrance can be busy and visible, while a side door can become a private channel with no witness assigned to it. If Kyron was let out, the simplest path is often not the main path. The simplest path is the one that looks like staff movement, a side corridor, a door near a classroom wing, a service exit, a route that does not require passing the front office. And here is the part that makes people uncomfortable. The adult who uses that route does not have to be staff. They only have to look like they know where they are going. Confidence is a costume. So what does the investigator do with that? They look for the places where confidence would matter most. They look at who could move smoothly without hesitation. They look at who knew the building. They look at who had been there before. They look at who had a reason to be there that day, or who could invent one without being challenged. But I am not here to hand you a villain. I am here to hand you the mechanics that determine whether any villain is plausible. That is the line I draw in this series. We separate suspicion from proof. We separate story from evidence, because long cases create noise, and noise can destroy the one thing a family needs most, which is a clean search for the truth. When a case remains unsolved for years, the public often begins to treat it like a puzzle. They discuss motives. They argue about personalities. They rank theories as if the truth is a vote. The truth is not a vote. The truth is a chain of actions that happened in a real place at a real time. In episode 2, we are tightening that chain. We take the last reported sighting and we treat it as a gate. If the child passed that gate, where could he go next? without being seen. If the child did not pass that gate, where was he last? Really? And who was nearby? Then we do the work that does not look dramatic, but breaks cases open. We look at the boring details. We look at sign and procedures, if any existed, for visitors. Not because a clipboard stops a predator, but because a clipboard creates a trace, a name, a handwriting sample, a time, a pattern. We look at parking, who arrived and left during the critical window. A vehicle is a moving room. It is also a record in a world full of habits. People park the same way. They choose the same spot. They exit the same route. Deviations matter. We look at routines. The custodian who always takes a cart down the same hallway at the same time. The office worker who always glances up when the door opens. The teacher who always stands by the classroom door for morning greetings. Routines create predictable witnesses. And in a case like this, the best witness is often the person who has no emotional story to tell. The person who is not connected to the family. The person who does not feel pressure to be correct. The person who simply remembers a detail because it was unusual in their day. A stranger in a school who does not belong might register as unusual, or they might not. That depends on the observer. Children notice shoes. Adults notice faces. Staff notice badges. Every group sees different things. So we ask everyone, and we do it carefully, and we do it without implying guilt, because you cannot bully truth into existence. You can only invite it out. Now let me take you into the kind of interview moment that makes my skin crawl even years later. You sit across from a parent who attended the science fair. Their child is safe. They came. They looked at projects. They left. They did not see anything alarming. And then you ask them to remember the hallway again, but you ask it differently. You ask them to remember the small wrongness. Was there an adult you did not recognize who seemed too comfortable? Was there an adult walking alone in the corridor that leads toward classrooms? Was there someone who seemed to be waiting rather than looking at projects? Was there a moment when a child walked the wrong direction for no clear reason? People do not store those details unless they know they matter. That is the tragedy. A child's disappearance makes the ordinary details become evidence after the fact. So the interview is a salvage operation. You are trying to pull meaning out of a memory that was never tagged as important. Sometimes it works. A person suddenly remembers a man with a folder, a woman with a hat, a vehicle parked at an odd angle, a door that opened when it should not have, a child who was not with a group. And sometimes it does not work. Sometimes the hallway stays blurred because it was blurred in real time. When that happens, you turn to the other side of the system. You look for anything that does not forget. In the modern world, we have cameras, but we do not always have them where we need them. We have records, but we do not always keep them long enough. We have technology, but we do not always deploy it in elementary schools the way we deploy it in banks. That is not a criticism. That is a reality. Schools are built for learning, not for surveillance. So the case becomes an exercise in the thin line between privacy and protection. After Kyron's disappearance, many communities across the country reevaluated school entry policies and event procedures. That is an echo that comes from a single missing child, a change in the way adults guard thresholds. But the change does not bring the child back. So we return again to that morning, and we ask the most important question of all. What is the smallest moment that can explain the largest outcome? If Kyron was let out, the smallest moment might be a simple interaction, a greeting, a suggestion, a request made with authority. A child following because children follow adults who sound certain. If Kyron left on his own, the smallest moment might be an impulse, a need to find someone, a curiosity, a confusion, a wrong turn. Either way, the case turns on a moment that probably looked like nothing. That is why these cases haunt me, because the enemy is not always a monster in the shadows. Sometimes the enemy is normalcy, the assumption that everything is fine. Now, in the real world, investigators also have to handle the human storm that follows a disappearance. Families fracture, relationships strain, accusations fly, media attention becomes its own weather system, and all of that can distract from the core question, which is what happened between the last known moment and the first alarm. I am not going to turn this into a tabloid. The family dynamics in any case matter only insofar as they produce verifiable facts. What did someone do? Not what did someone feel. Where did someone go? Not what did someone fear. What can be confirmed, not what can be imagined. This is how you keep a case clean. This is how you keep it from becoming a story that feeds on itself. In episode 2, we are standing right on the edge of the threshold, staring at doors and attendance sheets and human perception. We are watching how a building designed for children can become a corridor to silence if the wrong person uses the right moment. At the end of this episode, I want you to hold two images in your mind at the same time. The first image is the science fair hallway, bright and busy, full of parents who believe they are in a safe place. The second image is a quiet door at the end of a corridor, opening and closing without anyone registering that the world has just changed. Because if Kyron Horman left that building, it happened through something as simple as a door doing what doors do. In episode 3, we step outside. We follow the paths that begin at those doors and spill into distance, into roads, into woods, into a world where evidence can fade and time can bury truth. We will talk about searches, about terrain, about the difference between where people look and where reality leaves its marks. For now, this is the central fact of episode 2. A child vanished in the space between a system that assumes order and a moment that allowed disorder to look like normal. And that is how it happens in plain sight. I am Miller Files, and if episode 2 ended at the threshold of a quiet door, episode 3 begins on the other side of it. Outside the school, the world expands. Inside, there are rules. Outside, there is distance. Inside, a child is contained by routine. Outside, a child can be swallowed by terrain, or moved by intent, or lost to the simple fact that nobody is looking in the right place at the right time. This is where the case changes shape. The moment Kyron Horman is no longer a student in a building, he becomes a point on a map. And a point on a map is not a person unless you can connect it to movement. Movement is everything. Movement is what turns a missing child case into either a search problem or an abduction problem. A search problem is cruel, but it has a kind of logic. You calculate how far a child could walk. You look at the land as it is, not as you wish it was. You think about visibility, about water, about holes, about places a small body could be hidden by a world that does not care. You accept that children do not move like adults. They stop, they turn, they follow curiosity, they follow fear, they follow a sound, they follow an animal, they follow the wrong sense of direction and believe it is right. An abduction problem is cruel in a different way because the map explodes. A vehicle turns minutes into miles. A person with a plan does not have to stay close. They do not have to stay in the county. They do not have to stay in the state. The case becomes about routes and timing and the small habits that people never think of as evidence until they have to. In the public view, the search looks like a storm. People in jackets moving through brush, dogs working a line, volunteers calling a name, vehicles parked along roads, helicopters overhead. That image is real. The will behind it is real. The urgency is real. But in the investigator's mind, the search is mathematics under pressure. You start with the earliest moment the child could have been outside. That moment is a guess shaped by whatever you believe about the last sighting. Was 8:45 a.m. solid or soft? Was it a true time or a remembered time? Did the hallway witness him moving toward class, or did the hallway only witness what someone later believed they saw? The answer changes the radius in a way that is hard to explain to people who have never worked these cases. If a child left on foot at 8:45 a.m., the search radius is one thing. If a child left on foot at 8:15 a.m., it is another. If a child did not leave on foot at all, the ground search can become a ghost hunt, while the truth rides away on asphalt. That is why I always return to the idea of clocks. In missing child cases, you have at least 3 clocks running at once. There is the event clock, the time the child actually disappeared. There is the discovery clock, the time the world realized the child was gone. There is the response clock, the time the system mobilized. The public often judges the response clock. Was it fast? Was it slow? Did they do enough? But the case lives and dies on the gap between the event clock and the discovery clock. That gap is where evidence cools. That gap is where witnesses forget what they never knew mattered. That gap is where footprints get overwritten by normal life, by rain, by the movement of hundreds of feet that arrive to help and accidentally erase what they came to find. And there is a painful truth that nobody likes to say out loud. Searches are not perfect. They are human. They are conducted in real terrain with real limits. People miss things. Dogs miss things. Even helicopters miss things. Not because the searchers do not care, but because the world is large and a child is small. So investigators make choices. They choose where to focus based on the best working theory they have in that moment. And the best working theory is often built on incomplete information. In Kyron's case, the school sits in a landscape that can turn green into concealment. Trees do not announce what lies beneath them. Slopes can hide depressions. Water can carry away a trail. A service road can appear insignificant and still be the path that matters. When you are trying to understand what happened, you look for the first place outside that offers either concealment or speed. Concealment belongs to the search problem. Speed belongs to the abduction problem. So I stand in my mind at the edge of the campus and I watch 2 stories compete. In one story, Kyron exits alone. He is not running. He is not terrified. He is simply moving, perhaps trying to solve a small problem that feels big to a child. Find a person, find a bathroom, find a room, find the science fair again. Find the comfort of what he just left. He turns the wrong way, and the wrong way becomes farther with each step. At some point, the environment stops looking like a school and starts looking like everywhere else. That is when panic can begin. That is when a child can hide instead of seeking help. That is when a child can become quiet, and quiet is the enemy of discovery. In the other story, Kyron exits with an adult. The adult does not rush. The adult does not drag. The adult walks like someone who has the right to be there. They move toward a vehicle, not parked in the obvious place. They choose a path that avoids the front office and avoids the cluster of parents. The adult opens a door, the child gets in, and the world swallows the sound. From the outside, it is nothing. A car door closing, a vehicle pulling away. A normal action hiding an abnormal outcome. Both stories can coexist in the same reality until you find the one detail that collapses one of them. This is the work of Episode 3. We do not chase emotion. We chase the detail that collapses possibilities. What detail could do that? A confirmed sighting outside the building, even a fleeting one, changes everything. It anchors the event clock to a place beyond the hallway. It tells you which door mattered. A confirmed absence inside the building, such as a teacher who can swear the child never entered the classroom and can anchor that certainty to a specific moment, also changes everything. It narrows the window and forces the path back toward the last controlled space. A confirmed movement of a vehicle, a person leaving at an unusual time, a vehicle parked where it should not be, a pattern that deviated from routine can collapse the search problem into an abduction problem. A confirmed indicator that the child was distressed, such as a report of crying, hiding, or refusing to go somewhere, can collapse the abduction problem into a search problem, because it suggests the child's own choices played a role. But confirmed is the key word, not rumored, not suggested, not repeated until it sounds true. Confirmed. That is why long cases grow so hard. People remember the headline more clearly than they remember the hallway. They remember the story more clearly than they remember the texture of that morning. So the investigator becomes a librarian of human recollection, sorting truth from narrative, sorting anchors from fog. Now, let me tell you what it feels like to be in the middle of that work. It feels like standing in a forest with a flashlight that is too small. Every tree casts a shadow that looks like an answer. Every dip in the ground looks like a place a child could have gone. You walk and you scan and you keep walking because you cannot stop. The mind begins to imagine 1,000 scenes and you have to keep pulling it back to discipline. What can we know? What can we verify? What can we check? Then you go back to the roads and it feels like the opposite problem. It feels like staring at a river and trying to identify a single drop of water that passed a particular point at a particular second. Vehicles are everywhere. People drive past schools every day. On a science fair morning, even more people have a reason to be near a school. That is why investigators focus on the anomalies. The person who was not supposed to be there but was. The vehicle that moved differently. The route that made no sense. The story that cannot be reconciled with other stories. If you have ever wondered why investigators ask witnesses to repeat their account again and again, it is not because they enjoy pressure. It is because repetition reveals structure. A rehearsed lie stays smooth. A real memory changes in small ways, but keeps its core. The way a person describes a route, the way they recall a turn, the way they speak about a doorway, these details can align or break. And there is another reason. Sometimes witnesses do not lie. They protect themselves. They fear being blamed. They fear being seen as careless. They fear the attention that comes with being connected to a missing child case. So they minimize, they soften, they omit. Not out of malice, but out of survival. The investigator has to make room for that human fear while still demanding accuracy. It is one of the hardest balances in this work. You cannot bully truth into existence, but you also cannot let fear write the record. So Episode 3 becomes an exercise in respectful pressure, not pressure on people, but pressure on facts. Push them until they either hold or crack. And when a fact cracks, it reveals what it actually was. An assumption, an estimate, a story that felt right. At the end of episode 3, we are not solving the case. We are tightening the world around it. We are narrowing the corridors of possibility. We are trying to identify the first outside moment that belongs to Kyron's path, because that first outside moment is where the case becomes real in a new way. It becomes physical. It becomes earth and asphalt and sunlight and shadow. In episode 4, we will enter the storm that always follows, the storm of people. The family, the public, the media, the theories, the accusations, the pressure that can distort an investigation if it is not handled carefully. But we will do it the Miller Files way. We will keep the line between suspicion and proof. We will stay loyal to corroboration. We will treat every claim as a question until it earns the right to be a fact. For now, remember this: a school disappearance is not only about what happened inside, it is about the instant the inside became outside. It is about the door that mattered, the minute that mattered, the choice that mattered, the person that mattered. And somewhere in that instant, the truth still waits, untouched by the noise. I am Miller Files, and episode 3 left us standing at the edge of the campus, watching two stories compete in the open air. Now, in episode 4, we step into the storm that always follows a missing child case. Not the storm of weather or terrain. The storm of people, because once a disappearance leaves the realm of immediate search, it enters the far more treacherous realm of human interpretation. Families, communities, investigators, journalists, commentators, strangers on the internet. Everyone begins to fill the silence, and the silence is large enough to take whatever they pour into it. The danger is that the noise begins to look like evidence, and the louder the noise grows, the more it tries to bury the quiet facts beneath it. In the first hours after a disappearance, a family is not a single unit. It is a collision of grief and fear and guilt and disbelief. People expect clarity from families in crisis, but crises do not produce clarity. They produce fragments. One person is frantic. Another is numb. Someone talks too much. Someone says too little. Someone remembers a detail intensely. Someone forgets something they have done every day of their life. Investigators have to separate emotion from information without punishing the family for being human. And this is where episode 4 begins, in that tension between humanity and investigation. Families are not monolithic. They contain history, unresolved arguments, loyalty, resentment, trust, fractures, and old wounds. When a child disappears, all of that erupts. Some of it becomes public. Some of it stays whispered. Some of it becomes weaponized by outsiders who want a simple story. But nothing about a long-missing child case is simple. In a responsible investigation, you do not leap from tension to guilt. You observe, you document, you corroborate, you treat every statement as a piece of the landscape, not as a verdict. The investigator is not allowed to pick the story that feels satisfying. The investigator must follow the story that can survive scrutiny. But the public does not follow those rules. The public lives on instinct, and instinct wants a villain. When there is no clear suspect, the vacuum pulls the nearest person into its center: a parent, a step-parent, a teacher, a neighbor, someone who was near the last known moment, someone who behaves differently under pressure, someone who says something awkward under interrogation, someone whose grief does not match the public's expectations. I have watched this happen in case after case. The world wants an answer, so it manufactures one. A look becomes a clue. A pause becomes a confession. A contradiction becomes a conspiracy, and soon people forget the difference between suspicion and fact. In Episode 4, we rise above that noise, not because the noise is irrelevant, but because the noise is not evidence. So what is evidence? Evidence is what holds up when the emotion is stripped away. Evidence is what remains steady after 5 interviews, after 10 retellings, after 11 years. Evidence is what can be checked by someone who has never heard the story before. Evidence is not a feeling, not a rumor, not a consensus, not a comment thread. Evidence is what has weight. To understand the storm that surrounds this case, I want you to picture the investigation from the inside the sheriff's office. You have people who have been working the case for years. They do not get to indulge in theories. They cannot build their reputations on drama. They do the slow work. They track tips. They re-examine old leads with new technology. They interview again, not because they mistrust the witness, but because human memory shifts with time and can sometimes sharpen unexpectedly. They compare timelines. They eliminate impossibilities. They narrow what is left. And every time the case surfaces in the news, more tips arrive. Some valuable, some distorted by public narratives, some sincere but wrong, some malicious, some speculative, some hopeful, some hopeless. Each tip becomes a task, and every task takes time, and time is the one currency a missing child case never has enough of. Meanwhile, the family navigates an entirely different storm. There is grief in not knowing. There is guilt in imagining every possibility. There is blame, sometimes directed inward, sometimes outward. There are questions that wake a person in the middle of the night. Did I miss something? Did I fail somewhere? Should I have noticed? Should I have done more? Those questions are tortures that do not end. Then there is the judgment of strangers, people who believe they know how a parent should behave, people who expect perfect composure or perfect anguish, people who do not understand that trauma makes some people louder and some people silent. Trauma makes some people talk without filters and others unable to speak at all. In Episode 4, I want you to understand this clearly. Human reaction is not evidence. It is a symptom of being human. Investigators know this. They do not close a case because someone cried too much or too little. They do not make arrests because someone failed to maintain eye contact. They do not clear someone because they seem honest, and they do not accuse someone because they seem strange. They work from verifiable fact outward, not from speculation inward. This is why family dynamics become both important and dangerous in a missing child case. They are important because people close to the child know their routines, their fears, their habits, their potential vulnerabilities. They are dangerous because the pressure of the case can distort those relationships, and outsiders can turn any detail into a theory. So the investigator performs a balance act. They must ask every hard question without making assumptions. They must separate conflict from motive. They must separate personality from behavior. They must separate narrative from proof. And they must protect the integrity of the investigation from the gravitational pull of public opinion. And while that human storm rages, the case files are quietly expanding. Every interview becomes a transcript. Every search becomes a report. Every lead becomes a notation. Every timeline becomes a diagram. Every inconsistency becomes a conversation. The case grows into something enormous and heavy, a structure made of paper and memory and unresolved possibility. In long cases, people sometimes imagine the investigation has stalled. In reality, long cases often become deeper, more technical, more complex. They gain layers. They gain patterns, only visible with time. Investigators see relationships between facts that would not have been visible in the first month or the first year. But public pressure can distort that process. When a community feels fear, it wants answers. When a case feels stuck, it wants resolution. And when the narrative becomes louder than the facts, it becomes easy for people outside the investigation to believe they understand what the investigators do not. This is the storm, the collision of a family's pain, a community's fear, a media's hunger, and an investigator's discipline. So how do you navigate it? You return to the basics. You rebuild the timeline. Again, you check the alibis again. You examine the relationships again. You evaluate each person not by rumor, but by what can be corroborated. Again, you do the work repeatedly, because the truth in long cases often emerges not in a burst, but like a faint image developing slowly in a dark room. Episode 4 is where we acknowledge the noise without giving it power. It is where we see the fragile humanity that surrounds a case and the discipline required to keep the investigation steady. At the end of this episode, I want you to picture a single room. It is late at night. The sheriff's office is quiet. A detective sits alone at a table covered in binders. Every binder is thick. Every binder belongs to the same child. The detective turns a page, not because the page is new, but because the page deserves to be seen again. That is the reality behind the noise. Not outrage, not drama, not speculation, persistence. Because cases like this are not solved by lightning. They are solved by the slow, relentless pressure of people who refuse to let the truth disappear. Episode 5 will take us to the end of this documentary, not to a solution, because in the real world, the file remains open, but to the place where understanding becomes clarity, and clarity becomes the only path forward. Episode 5 is where we talk about hope, not the easy kind, but the kind that survives uncertainty, the kind that refuses to let the world forget a missing child. Until then, remember this: noise is temporary, but the truth is patient. It waits for the person who knows how to listen beneath the storm. I am Miller Files, and this is Episode 5, the final chapter of our documentary. The place where investigation meets endurance, where truth meets uncertainty, and where a missing child becomes more than a case file, becomes a reminder of what it means to hold on when the world offers no resolution. We have walked through the school, through the hallways, through the doors, through the terrain, and through the storm of human pressure. Now we stand at the place where every long-term investigation eventually arrives, the intersection of possibility and time. In most stories, people crave an ending, a moment where everything aligns, where the villain is unmasked, where justice arrives with satisfying symmetry. But real investigations rarely give that gift. Real investigations remain open, alive, shifting with new information, waiting for a lead that has not yet taken shape. And that is where the story of Kyron Horman lives, in the space between what we know and what we still need. But before we talk about hope, we must talk about endurance. When a case stretches beyond weeks, beyond months, beyond years, investigators face a challenge few people understand. The world moves on. News cycles rotate. Communities settle. But the case file does not grow old. It does not expire. It waits. Inside police departments, there are walls lined with binders, thick spines, tabbed sections, handwritten notes layered over typed reports. In one of those binders lies the story of a 7-year-old boy whose last known location was a school hallway on a June morning. The binder does not care how much time has passed. The missing child does not age out of priority. But humans age. Humans get tired. Humans carry sorrow. Families carry it most of all. A long-term missing child case is not one loss. It is a repeated loss. A loss relived every time a phone rings, every time a tip surfaces, every time a birthday arrives, every time a new age, progressed photo is released. It is a grief with no funeral, a wound with no closure, a question that grows heavier each year. Families in cases like this are often judged harshly. People think time should bring acceptance. It does not. Time brings accumulation, a layering of unanswered questions, a layering of imagined outcomes, a layering of guilt, whether deserved or not. But families are not alone in the endurance. Investigators feel it too. When you spend years with a case, you begin to know the missing child as if you had met them. You learn their routines, their smiles, their habits, their quirks. You learn the way their name sounds when spoken by people who love them. You learn the way silence falls when a parent has run out of words. And you learn something else, a truth that takes root deep inside anyone who works these cases long enough. A missing child is never forgotten by the people who search for them. But searching changes over time. In the early days of a case, search is physical. Boots in the mud, helicopters overhead, dogs moving through brush, officers scanning creek beds and ravines, volunteers combing fields, maps with circles and radiating lines, noise, urgency, movement. As years pass, search becomes something quieter. Digital forensics, new technology, DNA reprocessing, database cross-referencing, interviews revisited, old statements reevaluated under new light. And as decades pass, search becomes something else still, a promise. A promise that the file will remain open. A promise that any new lead will be checked. A promise that the child remains more than a photograph on a poster. In Episode 5, we finally talk about hope, not a cinematic hope, not a Hollywood rescue fantasy, but the real complicated hope that lives in long-term investigations. Real hope is not denial. Real hope is endurance. It is the willingness to stare at a case that has resisted answers for years and say, we will look again. It is the willingness to follow a lead that seems thin, because thin leads sometimes become thick truths. It is the willingness to believe that silence does not mean the end. Sometimes hope looks like new technology tools that did not exist in 2010 but exist now. Sometimes hope looks like a witness who suddenly remembers something they forgot to say. Sometimes hope looks like a person whose guilt becomes too heavy to carry. Sometimes hope looks like a discovery in a place nobody ever thought to search. And sometimes hope is simply the passage of time itself, because the truth has a way of surfacing when the world least expects it. But there is another kind of hope I want to talk about, a quieter kind, a more durable kind, the hope that comes from remembering the child as they were, not as a headline, not as a mystery, but as a person. Kyron was a boy who loved his science fair project, a boy with glasses and a shy smile, a boy who believed the world was safe because, for him, it had always been. When you spend years inside his case file, you learn that the tragedy of his disappearance is not just that he vanished. It is that he vanished in a place where safety was assumed. This assumption is what drives investigators. Not the sensationalism, not the speculation, not the public noise, but the simple idea that a child should never disappear without someone refusing to give up. Episode 5 is not about closure. It is about responsibility. The responsibility to keep asking questions. The responsibility to keep stripping away rumor until only truth remains. The responsibility to avoid easy answers. The responsibility to face the uncomfortable possibility that the truth may be neither simple nor satisfying. And the responsibility to speak the child's name long after the world has stopped listening. A documentary ends. A case does not. So, I want you to picture one last image as we bring this series to a close. It is early morning. A detective, maybe someone new, maybe someone who inherited the case from a predecessor, walks into an office lit by a single thin line of sunrise. They sit at a desk. They open a binder. It is the same binder that sat on desks 5, 10, 15 years before. The pages are worn, the tabs faded, but the name on the front is clear. They take a breath, they turn a page, and the search begins again. Not because someone demanded it, not because someone is watching, but because a missing child deserves that kind of persistence. Because that is what real hope looks like. Not a miracle, but a refusal. And if you want to know what stays with an investigator long after a case like this, it is not the theories, not the rumors, not the public storm. It is the simple belief that somewhere, somehow, the truth survived, and one day someone will find it. This has been episode 5. This has been the investigation. This has been the story of a child whose name must not fade. I am Miller Files, and I am still listening.